Somewhere off the coast of Oregon, right now, while you're watching this, a fault line the size of a small country is holding back more energy than every nuclear weapon on Earth combined. It has been doing this quietly for over 300 years. No shaking, no warning signs on the surface. Just silence. And that silence is the single most misleading thing about it, because underneath that silence, a piece of the planet is being bent, compressed, and dragged downward, millimeter by millimeter, storing up force that has nowhere to go until the day it suddenly does. That fault is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and if you live anywhere between Northern California and Southern British Columbia, you're standing directly on top of it right now. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, Eugene, Tacoma. Millions of people going about their normal lives, driving to work, dropping kids at school, completely unaware that beneath their feet sits one of the most dangerous geological structures on the entire planet. Scientists have been watching it for decades. Satellites are tracking it. Seismometers are listening to it. And in 2026, researchers are more confident than ever that this fault is going to move again. The only question left is when. Before we go further, I want to be upfront about something. This video is not here to scare you for the sake of scaring you. There's a version of this story that leans entirely into panic, doom, and worst-case imagery, and honestly, that version gets clicks. But it's not useful, and it's not the full picture. The real story here is more interesting than fear-mongering, because it's a story about geology, about history hiding in tree rings and seafloor mud, and about how much control we actually have over the outcome, even if we can't control the earthquake itself. So stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand this fault better than almost anyone around you does. Quick thing before we dive in. If stories like this genuinely interest you, hit subscribe now, because we cover major geological events, fault systems, and natural disaster science every week. And this channel is completely free to follow. And if you're the type of person who reads every comment section, drop a line below telling me how far you live from a known fault line, because I read all of them. And I'm always amazed at how many people had no idea they were sitting on top of something like this. Okay, let's actually get into the science. To understand why Cascadia is different from almost every other earthquake risk in the continental United States, you first need to understand that not all faults are built the same way. Most people, when they think of a major California earthquake, picture the San Andreas Fault. And for good reason. It's famous. It's been in movies. It's the fault most associated with the phrase, the big one. The San Andreas is what geologists call a strike slip fault. Picture two enormous plates sliding sideways past each other, like two conveyor belts grinding in opposite directions. That kind of fault can absolutely produce catastrophic earthquakes, no question. But it has a physical ceiling on how big it can get because of the geometry involved. Cascadia is a completely different kind of monster. It's what's called a subduction zone, and instead of two plates sliding past each other sideways, one plate is being forced underneath the other, plunging down into the Earth's mantle at an angle. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a smaller oceanic plate called the Juan de Fuca plate is being pushed underneath the much larger North American plate. In theory, this process should happen smoothly. The oceanic plate should just slide downward and eastward at a slow, steady pace of a few centimeters a year, quietly releasing pressure the entire time through small, mostly unnoticeable earthquakes. But that is not what is happening at Cascadia. And this is the part that should genuinely get your attention. The upper section of this subduction zone, the part closest to the surface, is locked. Friction between the two plates is so strong that instead of sliding smoothly, they're essentially welded together. The oceanic plate wants to keep moving. It is trying to move, but it physically can't because it's jammed against the plate above it. So all of that motion, all of that energy that should be releasing gradually, is instead getting stored, like a spring being wound tighter every single year with absolutely no release valve. Here's a detail that most people never think about, and it's honestly one of the eeriest parts of this entire story. Because of this locked fault, the coastline of Oregon and Washington is very slowly sinking right now. Not dramatically, not something you'd notice walking down the beach. But GPS stations along the coast have measured the land compressing downward and inward, exactly the way a diving board bends when you push down on the end of it and hold it there. That's what a locked subduction zone does to the crust above it. It bends the land itself, and it keeps bending it year after year, decade after decade, storing elastic energy the entire time. And when that spring finally releases, everything that was suppressed for centuries lets go all at once. The plate snaps back into position. The seafloor can jump upward by 10, 15, 20 feet in a matter of seconds. The coastline that was slowly sinking suddenly jolts upward, and the amount of energy released in that single moment is almost impossible for most people to conceptualize. This exact style of fault, a locked megathrust subduction zone, is what produced the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, a magnitude 9. One that triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. It's the same type of fault that produced the strongest earthquake ever recorded by modern instruments, the 1960 earthquake in Chile, magnitude 9. 5. Subduction zones are the only fault systems on the planet physically capable of producing earthquakes above magnitude 9. 0. Because they're the only ones with a rupture surface large enough to release that much stored energy in one event. Cascadia runs for roughly 700 miles along the coast, starting near Cape Mendocino in Northern California, running through Oregon and Washington, and continuing up into Vancouver Island in British Columbia. That's not some remote, uninhabited stretch of coastline either. This fault sits directly beneath or just offshore from Eureka, Coos Bay, Newport Astoria, and further inland, still very much within range of severe shaking Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, and Vancouver. We are talking about one of the most densely populated corridors in North America, sitting essentially on top of a loaded spring. Now here's where the story stops being theoretical, because we don't just suspect this fault has ruptured catastrophically before, we know it has, and we know almost exactly when. On the night of January 26, 1700, at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, the entire Cascadia fault let go in a single full-length rupture. Scientists estimate the magnitude was somewhere between 8, 7, and 9, 2. And the reason we can pin down the date so precisely comes from two completely independent sources of evidence on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean that line up perfectly. The first piece of evidence comes from the Pacific Northwest itself. Indigenous communities along the coast, from what is now Northern California up through Vancouver Island, carried oral histories passed down across generations describing a night of violent extended shaking, followed by the ocean rising and swallowing entire coastal villages. For a long time, these stories were treated by outside researchers as folklore rather than historical record. That changed once geologists started actually testing the physical landscape. Along the Washington and Oregon coast, there are eerie stands of dead cedar trees still standing upright in what are now tidal marshes, places researchers call ghost forests. These trees were once healthy, thriving forest, until the ground beneath them suddenly dropped several feet in an instant, flooding their roots with salt water and killing them almost immediately. When scientists counted the growth rings on these dead trees and cross-referenced them with climate data, the trees all stopped growing at the exact same point, corresponding to the winter of 1699 into 1700. The second piece of evidence comes from an ocean away, in Japan. Japanese coastal towns kept meticulous historical and administrative records for centuries, and buried in those records is a description of what's called an orphan tsunami, a tsunami that struck the coast with no earthquake felt beforehand, which is unusual and immediately notable to anyone documenting seismic events. These records describe waves striking the Japanese coastline on the night of January 27, 1700 local time. When modern seismologists worked backward using known tsunami travel speeds across the Pacific Ocean, the numbers pointed to a single origin point roughly 10 hours earlier on the Cascadia coast. That timeline lines up with the death of the ghost forests almost to the hour. So we know, with real scientific confidence, exactly when the last full-length Cascadia rupture happened. January 26, 1700, that was 326 years ago. And this next number is the one that keeps seismologists awake at night. A geologist named Chris Goldfinger, working out of Oregon State University, spent years drilling core samples out of the seafloor sediment off the Cascadia coast. Every time this fault ruptures, the violent shaking triggers underwater landslides that leave behind a very specific, identifiable layer of sediment called a turbidite by drilling deep into the seafloor. And counting these layers going back roughly 10,000 years, Goldfinger's research team identified more than 40 previous full and partial ruptures along this fault system. When they averaged out the time between the major full margin events, the ones that break the entire 700-mile length in a single event, the number that came back was startling. On average, a full rupture happens roughly every 240 years. We are currently at 326 years since the last one. We have already passed the historical average, and we're not close to it. We're 86 years beyond it. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a lot of content online gets irresponsible. Averages are not predictions, and an earthquake does not run on a countdown clock. The actual recorded gaps between Cascadia ruptures in the geological record have varied enormously, from as short as 100 years apart to as long as a full millennium between events. So the fact that we're past the average doesn't mean an alarm is about to go off tomorrow. But it also doesn't mean we get to ignore it. When a fault is already overdue by historical standards, and every single year adds more accumulated stress to a structure that is already locked and under pressure, scientists don't treat that as some random coincidence worth shrugging off. They treat it as an active, ongoing hazard that requires constant, serious monitoring, which is exactly what's happening right now, in real time, along this coastline. The United States Geological Survey, along with Oregon's Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, has published formal probability estimates for a future Cascadia rupture, and these numbers are genuinely worth sitting with for a moment instead of just skimming past them. Current estimates put the probability of a magnitude 8, 0, or larger earthquake occurring somewhere along the Cascadia Zone within the next 50 years at approximately 1 in 3. For a full margin rupture specifically, the kind that breaks the entire fault length at once and produces something in the range of magnitude 9. 0, the estimate drops to somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 7 over that same 50-year window. Those numbers might sound small when you first hear them, almost abstract, like statistics you'd nod at and forget 5 minutes later. They shouldn't be. For comparison, the odds of a major magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake striking the Hayward Fault in the San Francisco Bay Area within a similar 50-year window sit in roughly that same percentage range, and that fault is treated by California emergency planners as one of the single most dangerous fault lines in the entire state. A 1 in 3 chance of a magnitude 8 or larger event within the realistic lifespan of someone currently living in this region isn't some distant theoretical possibility reserved for textbooks. It is an active, ongoing hazard being planned around right now by emergency agencies across 3 states and 1 Canadian province. And here's why the actual size of the number matters so much more than people initially realize. The magnitude scale used to measure earthquakes is logarithmic, not linear. Every single whole number increase on that scale represents roughly 31 times more energy released. Not just a little more, 31 times more. That means a magnitude 9. 0 earthquake isn't moderately stronger than a magnitude 7. 0. It releases something close to 1,000 times more energy. A full margin Cascadia rupture at magnitude 9. 0 would dwarf almost every earthquake that has ever struck the continental United States throughout recorded history. So let's actually walk through what emergency planners genuinely expect to happen, because the specific details here matter far more than the headline number does. Start with the shaking itself. A typical California earthquake, even a serious one, might last somewhere between 15 and 60 seconds. A full margin Cascadia rupture is expected to produce continuous, violent ground shaking lasting somewhere between 3 and 6 minutes. Sit with that duration for a second, because most people have genuinely never experienced anything close to continuous, violent shaking for that length of time. Structural engineers consider this one of the most dangerous aspects of any subduction zone earthquake, because buildings that could easily survive a short, sharp jolt can still fail under that kind of extended, sustained shaking. As fatigue accumulates in structural joints and connections over those long minutes. Then there's the tsunami, and this is where the timeline becomes genuinely terrifying in a very practical, immediate sense. Because the rupture happens directly on the seafloor and involves the ocean floor itself lurching upward by potentially 20 feet or more in certain areas, an enormous volume of ocean water gets displaced almost instantly. Unlike a distant tsunami, say one generated by an earthquake thousands of miles away, which gives coastal communities hours of advance warning, a Cascadia-generated tsunami would begin arriving at the nearest coastline in as little as 10 to 20 minutes after the shaking even starts. For low-lying coastal towns, places like Long Beach in Washington or Seaside in Oregon, there simply wouldn't be time for a formal evacuation order to be issued, received, and acted upon through normal channels. The actual official guidance given to residents in these towns is blunt, almost startlingly so. If you feel strong or prolonged shaking anywhere near the coast, that shaking itself is your only warning. You move to high ground immediately, on foot if you have to, without waiting for any official instruction, because by the time an instruction could arrive, it may already be too late. Now think about the geography of who actually gets affected, because the danger doesn't stay confined to the immediate coastline. Portland and Seattle both sit on soft, sedimentary soil and river valleys, and even though both cities are 60 to 100 miles inland from the fault itself, they are still expected to experience significantly amplified shaking. Soft soil behaves the way a bowl of jelly does compared to a solid block. It shakes far more violently and for longer than solid bedrock would under the exact same seismic wave. Liquefaction, where saturated soil temporarily starts behaving like a liquid during intense shaking, is a serious concern in low-lying parts of both cities, particularly in older industrial zones, port facilities, and land that was artificially filled decades ago near rivers and waterways. And then there's infrastructure, which is honestly where the full weight of this scenario becomes genuinely sobering. A significant number of the bridges, overpasses, and highway connections linking coastal Oregon and Washington to the rest of the region were built before modern seismic building codes even existed. Regional emergency planning exercises run through FEMA have projected that virtually every highway bridge crossing the Coast Range could be damaged or completely destroyed in a full margin event, effectively cutting off coastal communities from any kind of inland support for an extended period. Not days, but potentially weeks. Interstate 5, the primary north-south corridor running directly through both Seattle and Portland, is expected to sustain serious structural damage at numerous points along its route. And ports, which are absolutely critical for fuel and supply distribution across the entire Pacific Northwest, tend to sit on exactly the kind of liquefaction-prone soil that performs worst during major shaking. FEMA's own regional planning documents, developed through a coordinated series of exercises known as Cascadia Rising, have estimated that in a worst-case full-margin rupture scenario, roughly 13,000 people could die, with many more seriously injured, and that certain coastal communities could be completely isolated from outside help for weeks at a time, because roads, bridges, airports, and ports would all sustain serious damage simultaneously, all at once, with no single unaffected route left to bring aid in through. A FEMA regional administrator who worked directly on this planning summarized it about as plainly as it's possible to summarize something this severe. The region west of Interstate 5, meaning the coastal strip exposed most directly to both the strongest shaking and the tsunami, would be functionally destroyed. That's not a dramatic phrase written for a headline. That is planning language, coming directly from the federal agency actually responsible for coordinating the response to an event like this. So here's the honest question worth pausing on. Is the Pacific Northwest doomed the way certain unprepared regions have been in recent earthquake disasters elsewhere in the world? Or does it already have the kind of infrastructure and preparedness that turned Japan's most recent major earthquake into something closer to a manageable event rather than a catastrophic one? The honest answer sits somewhere in between, and it's genuinely moving in the right direction, even though there's still a long way left to go. Here's the encouraging part first. Washington, Oregon, and California have all significantly strengthened their building codes over the last 3 decades, specifically in direct response to subduction zone research that didn't even exist in a meaningful way before the 1980s and 90s. New construction throughout the region, especially hospitals, schools, and other critical infrastructure, is now built to standards specifically designed to survive intense, prolonged shaking without fully collapsing, even if the structure itself sustains serious damage in the process. That distinction matters enormously. A building that cracks but stays standing gives people inside a chance. A building that collapses does not. The West Coast also has something called Shake Alert, an earthquake early warning system developed jointly by the USGS in partnership with UC Berkeley, Caltech, and the University of Washington. Shake Alert can, in certain scenarios, provide anywhere from a few seconds up to tens of seconds of warning before the most violent shaking actually arrives at a given location. That might not sound like much time, but it's enough to automatically slow down trains, trigger elevator doors to open at the nearest floor, and alert people through their phones to drop, take cover, and hold on before the strongest waves even hit. Now here's the harder truth. A huge percentage of existing buildings across both Seattle and Portland predate these updated codes entirely. Unreinforced masonry buildings, older brick structures that are extremely common throughout historic downtown districts in both cities are considered particularly vulnerable to this kind of extended shaking, and retrofitting them to modern standards is expensive and, in a lot of cities, still isn't even mandatory. Coastal tsunami evacuation infrastructure is slowly improving, with new vertical evacuation structures, essentially reinforced towers people can climb during a tsunami if they can't reach natural high ground in time, being constructed in a handful of especially vulnerable towns like Westport, Washington. But a large number of low-lying coastal communities still don't have anything like this nearby. And public education campaigns have had to work for years just to get residents to understand a basic, critical fact. A Cascadia-generated tsunami would arrive faster than any official evacuation order ever could. The comparison to Japan is genuinely useful here, not because the West Coast is anywhere close to Japan's level of seismic preparedness yet, but because Japan proves the exact point that keeps coming up again and again in every one of these stories. Geology sets the size of the event. It's fixed, unchangeable, decided by plate tectonics millions of years in the making. But human decisions, made years and decades in advance, are what actually determine how many people survive it. Japan spent roughly half a century deliberately building a deep culture of seismic readiness after suffering devastating losses earlier in the 20th century that forced the issue. The Pacific Northwest is maybe 1 to 2 decades into that same long process, largely because widespread public awareness of the Cascadia threat itself is still relatively recent, only really becoming mainstream common knowledge in the last decade or so, after investigative journalism finally brought the underlying science to a general audience for the first time. If you've been paying attention to recent seismic headlines, you've probably noticed a pattern. Stories about the San Andreas Fault reaching historically elevated stress levels, major earthquakes striking multiple countries within weeks of each other, and now renewed attention on Cascadia specifically. It's completely natural to start wondering whether something unusual is happening to the planet as a whole right now. It isn't, at least not in the sense of some hidden global trigger suddenly activating every major fault at once. Cascadia, the San Andreas, and the subduction zones near Japan and elsewhere in the Pacific are geologically independent systems, separated by thousands of miles, with no meaningful mechanical connection between them. An earthquake happening on one system doesn't trigger or meaningfully influence an earthquake on another system located that far away. What's actually happening is simpler and honestly more important than any hidden global mechanism would be. Scientific monitoring technology, satellite-based ground deformation measurement, dense modern seismometer networks, decades of accumulated sediment core and tree ring research has advanced enormously over just the past 20 years. We are now able to detect and understand fault stress patterns with a level of precision that simply didn't exist a single generation ago. Combine that improved visibility with a growing global population, increasingly concentrated in coastal, seismically active cities, and you naturally get more headlines. Not because the Earth itself suddenly became more dangerous overnight, but because we can now see the danger that was always there with far greater clarity than we ever could before, and because there are simply more people living directly in its path than at any point in history. Cascadia has always been sitting there, locked, quietly accumulating stress for over 3 centuries straight, indifferent to whether anyone above it is paying attention. We try to end videos like this with something genuinely useful, because raw, unfiltered information without any actionable next step tends to just create anxiety, and that has never been the goal here. So if you live anywhere within the Cascadia impact zone, from Northern California all the way up through British Columbia, here's what actually matters in practical terms. Know whether you're standing inside a tsunami inundation zone. Coastal counties throughout Oregon and Washington publish detailed, publicly available tsunami hazard maps online, and knowing your specific zone in advance means you don't waste critical minutes trying to figure it out in the middle of an actual event, when every second counts more than you can currently imagine. If you live near the coast, physically walk your evacuation route to high ground at least once so your body actually knows the path. Not just your mind, reading it off a map at home. Muscle memory matters enormously under panic and adrenaline. If you're further inland, in cities like Portland or Seattle, the priorities shift closer to standard major earthquake preparedness. Keep at least 2 weeks of food, water, and any essential medication on hand if you're able to, since regional supply chains could realistically be disrupted for an extended stretch. Not just a few days like you might assume from smaller, more localized disasters. Know exactly how to shut off your home's gas line manually. Secure heavy furniture, water heaters, and bookshelves directly to wall studs, since falling objects and toppled furniture cause a disproportionate number of earthquake injuries. Put together a family communication plan that doesn't rely entirely on cell networks, since those systems are extremely likely to fail or become instantly overloaded in the immediate aftermath of a major quake. And consider downloading the Shake Alert-powered early warning app available for your specific state, since even a handful of seconds of advance notice can meaningfully reduce injury from falling debris and objects. None of this requires panic. It genuinely doesn't. What it requires is the same kind of unglamorous, boring, methodical preparation that has historically been the single biggest factor separating a catastrophic disaster from a survivable one. Everywhere in the world, this exact kind of fault has ruptured before. Whether that's Japan in 2011 or the ongoing monitoring efforts happening across Chile right now, here's the thing genuinely worth sitting with as we wrap this up. The Cascadia Subduction Zone has produced a major, full-length rupture roughly every 240 years on average, going back nearly 10,000 years into the geological record. And right now in 2026, we are already 86 years past that historical average, with no visible sign of releasing early, and equally, no visible sign of releasing on any particular schedule at all. That is not a prediction of exactly when the next one hits. Nobody can honestly give you that. Not the USGS, not Oregon State University, not a single working seismologist anywhere on Earth can tell you with any real confidence whether this happens next year, in 10 years, or in another full century from now. Earthquake prediction, in the strict sense of naming an actual date in advance, remains scientifically impossible with current technology. And anyone online confidently claiming otherwise simply isn't speaking for the genuine scientific consensus, no matter how convincingly they present it. What scientists can tell you with real, well-documented confidence is that this fault is real. It is currently locked. It has done exactly this before at a scale most people never fully appreciate, until they actually sit with the numbers, and it will absolutely do it again at some point. The only genuinely open question left is timing. And the only thing that actually determines the human cost when it finally happens is how seriously this region takes the decades of preparation sitting between right now and that day. The Pacific Northwest is not some unprepared region caught completely off guard the way certain other places have been in recent disasters. It has functioning institutions, updated codes for new construction, and a growing, increasingly sophisticated early warning system actively being expanded every year. But it's also not yet at Japan's level either. Not in terms of decades of deeply ingrained seismic culture and generational infrastructure investment. It sits somewhere in the middle, on a clock that literally nobody alive can read, resting directly above a fault that has already proven, in both the historical record and the geological record, exactly what it is fully capable of doing. The ground beneath the West Coast has been quiet for 326 years now. That silence has never once meant the absence of danger. It has only ever meant a spring being wound tighter one more year at a time, with no release valve in sight. The question was never really whether the Cascadia Subduction Zone would eventually rupture again. That part was decided by plate tectonics millions of years before any of us were born. The only real question left is simply when, and whether the millions of people currently living directly above it will actually be ready when that moment finally arrives. If this kind of deep dive into major fault systems and earthquake risk is something you want more of, subscribe now, because we're going to keep tracking every meaningful development in this story, from new stress modeling coming out of the fault itself to fresh updates on tsunami evacuation infrastructure being built right now along the coast. And before you go, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching this from, especially if you live anywhere near the Pacific coastline, because these stories genuinely hit differently once you realize exactly how many people are living right on top of one, often without ever knowing it. See you in the next one.